Okay, we're going to get started here. Our next speaker is Soeren Kern. He's been here a couple of times before, and he's an expert on Islam and European Union. He was an advisor to the Spanish government for 19 years or something like that, and he is the son of a Lutheran minister from Wisconsin who got interested in Bible prophecy at some point in his life. And he served in military intelligence. He has a master's degree from Georgetown, in political science type stuff. And he works for the Gatestone Institute, which is headed by John Bolton, if you're familiar with him. And he is one of the leading experts, I can say this clearly, in the West on Islam and how it's going to impact the West, as well as how it relates to the European Union and things. So, let her rip.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege for me to be back. I really enjoy these conferences because usually I'm in the secular world, but really we're dealing with spiritual issues on a lot of these international questions, and it's really great to be among brothers and sisters in the faith. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Europe this past 18 months, regarding the influx of almost 2 million migrants from the Middle East. It's really bringing about massive changes in Europe, and those changes are definitely going to be coming to the United States as well. And so I think that as we kind of take a look at some of the repercussions of mass migration, of open borders, particularly from the Muslim world in Europe, we can sort of anticipate what might happen here in the United States and Canada and other Western countries if policymakers are not careful with this issue. I just wanted to start out, my presentation is about politics, not about apologetics, but just to set the base, I think it's very important to understand what Islam is. My interpretation of Islam is essentially that it's not really a religion, it's a political system that is shrouded in religious garb. Now, the whole object of Islam is essentially to deny the deity of Jesus Christ. That's the basis of Islam. And the way, Islam means submission to the will of Allah. The will of Allah is essentially Sharia law, and it's to bring the entire world under submission to the idea that Jesus Christ is not our Lord and Savior. It's essentially the way I see Islam, plain and simple. The danger, as you can see with this chart, is essentially that religion, the religiosity of Islam is really a very, very small piece of what Islam is really about. We're talking here really primarily about the Sharia law. And it's very, very worrisome to me. We see Sharia law making inroads in all Western countries, particularly in the UK, also in Germany and France and Netherlands and Belgium, to some extent even in Canada and the United States. And just to understand, Sharia law, under Sharia law, there is no freedom of religion. Islam is a supremacist ideology that is bent on world domination, to bring the entire world under the dominion of this political system. So, in other words, Sharia law and Western concepts of democracy are completely incompatible in any way that you can understand the issue. Sharia, no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, no freedom of thought, no freedom of artistic expression, no freedom of the press, no equality of peoples. In other words, Muslims and non-Muslims are not equal. No protection, no equal protection for non-Muslims, no equal rights for women. And essentially, this is the Sharia code that many Muslims, particularly the Islamists, are trying to impose in the Western world. And what we see in many countries now is a parallel justice system, I'll talk about that a little bit later, in which elements of the Sharia law are already being enacted, are already being practiced in many Western countries. So what you have essentially is two-tier judiciary in which, although most Western constitutions guarantee equal rights for women and non-Muslims, in the Sharia that is not the case. And it's a very, very dangerous encroachment, I think, on Western norms of democracy. And it comes right from the beginning, the founder of Islam, from Muhammad. I have been ordered to wage war against mankind until they accept that there is no God but Allah, and that they believe I am his prophet and accept all revelations spoken through me. I mean, this is essentially what all Muslims believe and what pious Muslims are trying to bring about in the political system. A friend of mine, Bat Yor, she wrote this: "Jihad is a normal and permanent state of war between Muslims and non-Muslims, a war that can only end with the final domination over unbelievers and the absolute supremacy of Islam throughout the world." So this is what we're talking about here when we're trying to understand what Islam is all about. And here you have it from the Council on American Islamic Relations. Islam is not in America to be equal to any other faith, but to become dominant. The Quran should be the highest authority in America, and Islam the only accepted religion on earth. So I just throw this out there so we understand the implications. This is not a moment in history to be politically correct and be open to different worldviews. This is a very, very dangerous ideology that the West is facing, and there are very few policymakers in governments in the West today that really have an understanding of the nature, the true nature of Islam. Here, the jihad is essentially a way to spread Islamic ideology throughout the world. There's nonviolent jihad and there's violent jihad. And one form of the nonviolent jihad really is through demographics. It's essentially, many Muslims understand that at this point in history, Muslims cannot conquer the West through military means, but they can do through demographics. And another very important aspect of all this really is hijra. Hijra is an Arabic word for immigration. And this is really the stepping stone of what I want to talk about today. We can see here that the Pew Foundation in Washington, D.C. projects a massive increase in the number of Muslims in the United States over the next 20 or 30 years. In the world, you can see the United States has a massive increase. You see Europe a little bit lesser to some extent, but the fact of the matter is that the process of Islamization in Europe is already so far ahead of the United States that really at some point in time the United States and Europe are going to be facing really the exact same challenges. We've probably seen some of these images over the last year or so. There's been a massive movement of migrants due to the Syrian civil war. I should add that if you look at these photos, most of these migrants are young males. This is not really a migration of families who are seeking to escape the chaotic conditions in Syria. This is a situation in which there are hundreds of thousands of migrants from across the Arab Muslim world who are posing as refugees, who are trying to take advantage of European compassion or folly, however you want to understand it. And they're basically getting they're able to infiltrate Europe, and they're essentially economic migrants. They're just trying to find a better life for themselves. But as we're going to see, the implications of allowing these people into Western countries is truly massive. These are just some images of people making their way through Austria into Germany, and we're talking about really of just massive numbers of people. In all, Germany took in about 1.1 million migrants last year. They're still coming in this year at the rate of about 25,000 a month. So we're still looking at around 300,000 to 400,000 migrants. And the issue with all of this is when the bona fide asylum seekers have their applications approved, they're going to be able to bring in family members, wives, children, in many cases polygamous marriages. We'll talk about that a little bit. So we're talking about really a situation in which this 1.1 million migrants that came in last year can really blossom very, very easily to 5 or 6 million within a very short period of time. And so what we're going to see essentially is in a situation like Germany, which already has around 6 million Muslim migrants. A lot of them are Turks, some of them are Arabs, and there's a distinction there in terms of ethnicity. But you can really see a situation in which, in a very short period of time, the Muslim population of Germany will be around 20 million. And so we're talking about in a country of 80 million, 1/4, or 1/5 of the population is going to be Muslim. And Europe, and particularly Germany, is never going to recover from this apart from a mass deportation. And that, in this politically correct era, is never going to happen. So what we're really seeing here is a massive societal change in these Western European countries, and it's really coming here as well. This is really an image of boats, migrants coming into Italy, the image of migrants trying to cross the border from Spain. You can see in this map essentially that there are approximately 7 main routes that the migrants use to get into Europe. And so we see, approximately 20 million people are still waiting. They're on the move. They're still waiting to get into Europe. So what we saw last year and this year in terms of the 1 million, 1.1 million, 1.5 million numbers is really a drop in the bucket compared to what is still to come. You can see here the main migratory routes into Europe are primarily through Turkey, Greece, and from Libya into Italy, and then to some extent into south of Spain. You can see here's another image of the migrant moves. A lot of these people are really coming from Afghanistan and Iran and other parts of the Middle East, Pakistan. They're not really Syrian refugees. And you can see also the people coming from Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. These are people that are coming really from some areas are conflict zones, but primarily these are just people that are taking advantage of this migratory chaos to find a better life for themselves in Europe. Once these people get into the EU, because of European law, it's very difficult to deport these people. So essentially they know once they have their foot on EU soil, they have it made. And so you can see really the migrants are coming from Turkey on this image. They go into Greece and then they sort of make their way up by foot through the Balkans and into Hungary, into Vienna, and on their way to Germany. Most of these people do choose to go to Germany or to some of the Scandinavian countries because they're wealthy and their social welfare handouts are very generous. You see actually very few people going to Spain because Spain does not have the same generosity. So what they do is when they do get to Spain, they essentially make their way through France and then they go into the more prosperous northern European countries. This is an image essentially of the migratory routes coming from North Africa, primarily Libya, but also Egypt. And just once they get their foot in Lampedusa, or once they get their foot in Malta, Sardinia, in Sicily, they're on EU soil and they're essentially protected. And then they essentially become wards of the EU state, and they become distributed into different parts of the EU. There's also an image how people come from the Middle East and they make their way through into Spain. You may know that Spain has 2 exclaves in northern Africa called Ceuta and Melilla. And essentially when they are able to just climb that wall from Morocco into Melilla, they're in EU territory and then essentially safe. So there's a lot of economic incentive for this. This is just different points where migrants come from Morocco and cross the Strait of Gibraltar to make their way into Spain. I might just add a very big element of this is Turkey and the Turkey-EU deal. You may have heard about this. Essentially, Turkey wants to become a member of the EU. The Europeans have essentially strung the Turks along for at least 20, 25 years. And there's really no prospect of the Turkey becoming a member of the EU anytime soon, particularly after the coup on July 15th, and really the the crackdown on political freedoms and on journalists. What basically has happened is that the EU and Turkey have come to an agreement that Turkey would halt the flow of migrants from the Middle East to Greece and to Bulgaria, some of the other Eastern European countries, in exchange for 2 things. One thing is that the EU offers a visa waiver on all Turkish citizens. In other words, there will be approximately 80 million, 78 million Turks that would be allowed entry into the EU without a waiver, without a visa. This is a huge security problem. I mean, it's really inconceivable that the EU would actually allow something like this. And obviously, if these Turks make their way into the EU, they would have relatively easy access to the United States and other Western countries as well. So this EU-Turkey deal has stuck for the last 6 months or so, and that's one of the reasons why the migratory flows have been a little bit lower this year. Actually, the migratory flows are higher through Italy this year because they're mostly coming through Libya. But Turkey has kept up its end of the bargain, but it's now threatening essentially to renege on that deal. And that's essentially because the Europeans have not kept up their end of the bargain. which is the Turkey waiver deal, and so I think that there's a possibility that we're going to see here in a very short period of time at least another 3 million migrants making their way into southern Europe and obviously into Germany in a very short period of time, unless the Europeans get this situation under control. Why did Angela Merkel allow all these people into the EU? I think basically, in my own assessment, there's really one reason for it. It's not because she's generous and she's compassionate. It's basically because the future of the European project, of the European Union, is very much in doubt. The EU is essentially built on two pillars, and one is the common currency, the euro currency, and the other pillar is essentially the open borders. It's a Schengen agreement, which means that when you enter one country of the EU, essentially don't have to show your passport for the rest of the time that you're crossing borders in the EU. So you can see here, essentially, these blue countries are all members of the Eurozone. And the Eurozone essentially is not sustainable in its current configuration. That's because, as you can see here, these countries in Southern Europe are very indebted. In most of these cases in Greece, Spain, more than 100% of GDP to debt ratio. I mean, it's really not sustainable. And now that the Italian Prime Minister has lost his constitutional referendum yesterday, there is very possibly going to be a run on Italian banks. There are 4 very, very large Italian banks that are essentially bankrupt. And so this has huge implications. Bailing out Greece or Portugal is one issue, but Italy is really a major, major economic powerhouse in Europe. It's one of the 4 largest economies in the Eurozone, and essentially is not enough money available to bail out a country like Italy. So I think that if there is a run on the banks in the next couple of weeks, if there's a really economic calamity in Italy, we're going to see a breakup of the Eurozone here in a very short order. And there's going to be a reconstitution of the euro, with the northern wealthy countries being in one currency zone and the southern European countries in another zone. And the reason why here is the Schengen area, these blue countries are all members of the Schengen Agreement, which means essentially that if I arrive in Europe and Spain, I can make my way all the way to Poland and I never have to show my passport again. This is very convenient for anybody who's lived in Europe or travels in Europe, but it's also it's a security problem, because if a migrant, if an ISIS jihad is posing as a migrant, can get his way into Greece, he essentially can make his way through the rest of the EU without having to show a passport. And so it's really a double-edged sword in terms of security. And so what Angela Merkel has really wanted to do is to let these migrants into the EU as a way to preserve the Schengen Agreement, to preserve the open borders. Because if you close the borders and the currency, the single currency, is essentially in collapse, you really have put an end to the whole reason for being of the EU. And I think this is really what is playing itself out right now. These are some images of migrants in the Budapest train station. And this was really a public relations fiasco for the EU when all these people were stuck there. As you know, the Hungarian Prime Minister is not a friend of Islam. He's certainly not a friend of mass migration. And that is partly because Hungary and several other Eastern European countries were under Ottoman domination for centuries. And so the Eastern Europeans, I think, have a better understanding of the dangers of this mass migration from the Muslim world, but the EU head, particularly Angela Merkel, is really primarily concerned with preserving the integrity of the EU. So I think that's really the politics behind it. I would just point out, essentially, with this picture, that mass migration from the Muslim world is nothing new to Europe. This image is from 1961. And essentially, during the Second World War, a whole generation of European males was wiped out. And in order to rebuild Europe, France, the Benelux countries, they needed to bring in workers. And what they did was bring in many Turks to run the factories and to sort of rebuild Europe. And so this is an image really of people coming from, Turks coming from Istanbul into Germany. And essentially, the idea was always that they would stay for a short period of time and then they would go back to Turkey. But what has happened is that they stayed, and now what we have is second, third, and fourth generation Turks in Germany. I mean, they're a permanent part of the fixture. What you have here is essentially is an image of Germany in population decline. It's in demographic decline. The Germans and most other European countries are not having enough children to sustain the population. And so what you have, you can see here on all of the images except for the red, which is primarily in the south in Bavaria, heavily Roman Catholic, all of Germany is producing either at 0 or negative birth rates. And so the idea of some German policymakers is if that just bring in millions of Muslim migrants like this previous wave, that they can essentially solve their demographic problem. And I'm really referring essentially to the integrity of the Social Security, social welfare state. You can see also this image here is an image of the aging. Not only is German population declining, but it's also aging. So what you have here really is an image from 2010 to 2030. And you can see all of these images in red, heavy red, are people who are above the age of 46, 47, 50. So you see Germany is really facing an existential demographic issue when there's a belief, that they can resolve this issue by bringing in all of these migrants. Now, it should be pointed out that when Angela Merkel opened the doors, she said that most of these people coming in were college educated. They were doctors, lawyers, physicians, scientists. Well, that's what they said in terms of trying to pacify the public. As of my latest statistics that I read, of the 1.1 million who came in last year, 30,000 have found jobs, mostly blue-collar jobs, and only 54 have been hired by the DAX, that would be like the equivalent of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, and 50 of them have been hired by the German postal system, which is one of the top companies in Germany. So essentially, out of the 1.1 million people, 4 professionals have been hired, and really, you could see that this is not a contribution to the future of Germany's economic well-being. Okay, this is essentially an image of the refugee shelters in Germany. They're essentially scattered over the entire country. Just an unbelievable, logistical, undertaking. This is an image of Hamburg, where my mother was originally from, and you can just see, like, this in a city of Hamburg, it's the second largest city in Germany, where they're distributed essentially in all parts. What has happened now is that there's no more space to put these people, so the government has actually been appropriating private property. And so this is a whole other issue of essentially of, people having to give up apartments, having to give up buildings, anything that's vacant, vacation homes, second homes. The state is essentially taking that away from people in order to house migrants. So you see, this is something that's really ballooning into massive proportions. This is a typical refugee shelter in Germany. You can see that some people have been in these shelters now for a year. I mean, it's really despair for the migrants themselves. You can see that there's really not a whole lot of privacy. It's really many churches. This is a church in Hamburg, for example. Since people don't go to church anymore in Europe, these churches are vacant, and they're essentially being used as migrant shelters. This is the Lutheran Church in Hamburg, St. Pauli Church. This is a church in another part of Germany. The problem to have 1.1 million, mostly male migrants, just sitting around all day is it creates a lot of problems. They're shiftless, and this image here is of Cologne. You probably heard that last year during New Year's Eve, there were mass assaults against German women by migrants. There were more than 1,500 victims, either sexually assaulted or raped, and in front of the cathedral. That's the main cathedral in Cologne, the symbol of German Christianity, during the Reformation period. And what you have now is a situation in which of these 1,500 cases, not a single individual has been prosecuted. In fact, German authorities tried to keep this under wraps. They denied that there were actually these rapes taking place until cell phone footage and information about this appeared on social media. And so it didn't just happen in Cologne. These are all areas in Germany and in Austria and Switzerland where sexual assaults took place just on New Year's Eve. And essentially, this is an image of Taharush. It's essentially a game in which Arab men surround a individual female. They basically find females that are in a group, and they try to separate her from the group, and then they assault her. And this is essentially a common practice. Now, this is an image of sexual assaults in Germany committed by migrants. I've documented this at the Gatestone Institute extensively. This is really an incredible tragedy that is that's taking place against German women and children. There were rapes. A 19-year-old Moroccan raped a 90-year-old woman who was coming out of church service in Düsseldorf about 2 weeks ago. The way the German authorities try to cover this up is they said that this guy was a homeless man. And then it turns out essentially that he was a Southern European. And then digging a little deeper, it turns out actually that this guy was a Moroccan, 19-year-old Moroccan who happened to have a Spanish passport, And so there's a lot of political correctness and attempts by the German government, by the German authorities to cover up this. But there was a case in Germany where a woman was walking her child through the park in midday, and two migrants came up behind her. They raped her, and they forced the child to watch the attack taking place. I've documented thousands of these cases, and it's just basically, it's shocking that there's no place in Germany that is safe. Really, everywhere you go, there's a danger of some kind of a crime or some kind of a sexual assault. So really, the security situation in Germany has deteriorated completely. You see very common now that there are cartoons, rules trying to tell migrants that they are not supposed to touch, German females. So the German government has completely really lost control over this situation. One problem that really bothers me, that worries me a lot, is that these migrants are shiftless, they're sitting around, they have no prospect really of finding a job. And this image here is of the Salafist movement. It's a very radical Islam. Salafism is a movement that tries to take Islam back to what it was during the time of Muhammad. They're making major inroads in all European countries, and particularly in Germany. And they're in a campaign right now to distribute a German language Quran into every household in Germany. And, the word lies in English, but in Germany it means lies, which means to read. And so what is happening is essentially that a lot of these young, shiftless migrants are becoming radicalized by the Salafists because they have no hope of integrating into German society. So the Salafists are taking advantage of that to bring these people into their ranks and trying to recruit these people for violent jihad. Now, this is an image of a Sharia police. It's essentially a Muslim vigilante gang. Just last week, I just wrote an article about this, about Sharia law in Germany. Just last week, a German court ruled that this is not illegal, that they are within their rights to wear these uniforms and enforce Sharia law on German streets. And the court actually said that it was part of their right for the expression of free speech. So you see that there's a collapse in common sense, and it's all because of political correctness. It's because of multiculturalism. And believe me, it's coming here to the United States as well. These are just some, books that have recently appeared in the German press, in the German, book market. One of them just documents the extent of Sharia justice. It's essentially a parallel justice system in Germany right now. My latest, estimations that I've read is that there are at least 500 Sharia judges in Germany right now. And essentially, they adjudicate a lot of civil law. And as I mentioned earlier, that sets up a really big, a legal problem, because you have two standards of justice that are competing with each other. And this other book is a really interesting book that a German policewoman just recently wrote. And it's just talking about how migrants, particularly Muslim migrants, have absolutely no respect for authority. They have no respect for German police. And there are a lot of assaults against German police. So you can see that there's really a breakdown in law and order. This is an image here of Salafists, pro-ISIS people openly attacking German police on the streets. You see this kind of breakdown. What you have here is an image essentially of where football hooligans, who usually are fighting themselves during football matches, are now coming together to fight the Salafists because the German police are not doing their job. So you have really here is images of police trying to keep the Salafists and the hooligans apart. You have all the issues of no-go zones. You have areas where there are area districts in European cities, and particularly in Germany, where 60, 70, 80% of the population is a foreigner, mostly Muslim. You have here is an image, for example, in some districts, Woolworth shopping, stores. They're removing all Christmas merchandise because it's offensive to Muslims. You see this gradual move. You see this is so much more common in Europe now. These women in hijab or women in burqa, women covered. It's just this is not Islamic law. This is basically a political statement by these women saying that Islam is here and we're not going to integrate into German society. You know, there's the other problem is polygamy. Polygamy is outlawed in all European countries, but Germany, the UK, all these countries make exception for the migrants in particular. And so what happens is these migrants are able to bring in 3 or 4 wives and all the children. You have one case in Germany where there's 24 offspring, and they're all basically receiving welfare payments from the German state. So you have parts of Berlin, you know, there's just thousands of these polygamous marriages and also child marriages. This is a big issue in Germany right now. There are around 1,500 child marriages, young girls who are married off who have come in with these refugee flows. It's not just in Germany the problem. This is an image of Calais. It's called the jungle in northern France. All these people want to go to the UK because the UK has a very active black market. It's very easy for people to find jobs there and get good paying jobs. So the trick is basically how can these migrants get across the English Channel, you know? So just recently the French government has destroyed this, has demolished it, but they are on their way back. The French government has destroyed the jungle multiple times and it always rebuilds itself. You can see here images of migrants trying to get onto lorries, onto trucks, trying to cross the English Channel. When the trucks are stopped at customs, the migrants go into the back. Now that the jungle has been shut down, a lot of these migrants have been setting up just makeshift shelters in Paris. This is very close to the Gare du Nord, the main train station that connects France to the UK. Just chaos on French streets. This is Paris. You know, this is, they call it the Battle of Stalingrad. There's a metro station called Stalingrad in Paris, and there have been recently wars, essentially, between different ethnicities of migrants taking place on the streets of Paris, you know, very close to the Gare du Nord. This is an image of migrants in Lake Como, a resort town, beautiful place in Italy. This is an image of the Milan train station, just migrants just hanging out. This is an image of Rome, I believe. Yeah, this is Rome as well. This is Rome. This is Athens, Greece. So you really see is a massive problem of trying to, to integrate these people into the European workforce. I think the challenge for European policymakers essentially is how to deal with this issue. What they're trying to do is to create a new brand of Islam, and they're calling it European Islam. They're trying to create an Islam that sort of, is compatible with European post-Enlightenment values of democracy and free speech. And the real question that I see for the future of this issue is Europe, is Islam going to be Europeanized, or is Europe going to be Islamized? And I think that there's really no chance of reforming Islam. There's no possibility of a reform of Islam the way it was, during the Protestant Reformation, because essentially Martin Luther, what he wanted to do was bring the hermeneutics of Christianity back to a literal interpretation of the original text. The problem with Islam is that the original texts say what they say. So if you go to the original interpretation, it is essentially world domination. So there's really no possibility, to my mind, of trying to bring about a Europeanized Islam. You see the same problem in the UK. There are parts of London and parts of Birmingham and Leicester and other places really where, sometimes 60, 70%. About a year ago, I wrote an article about no-go zones in the UK, and it's very interesting. There's an appendix there, and it shows really by district the Muslim population. There are parts of the UK where 70 or almost 80% of certain districts are Muslim. And so they obviously go by a different justice system. You see this thing playing itself out there. At least 80 Sharia courts that are officially sanctioned by the British government to adjudicate, Sharia law in the UK. And you see the Sharia thing also playing itself out in many areas, like with halal foods. You have a lot of Western companies who are catering to the Muslim market because of the, the profit incentive. In some cases of the UK, there's actually only halal. There was recently a case of a Kentucky Fried Chicken, I think, whereas only halal food, the animals are slaughtered according to Islamic method, and the meat, the animals are, dedicated to Allah before they're slaughtered. So you have this encroaching Sharia law really in all aspects. You also have, European financial centers, whether it's the UK, Berlin, whether it's London, Berlin, or Paris, vying to be Islamic Sharia finance centers. So you really see this creeping Sharia as not just the imposition of certain moral standards, but it's imposition of all aspects of Islamic life. And I call it really the mainstreaming of Islam in Europe. There's an attempt basically to make Islam a normal part of European life. It's just basically that it's always been there and always been a part of European life, and it's has the same right essentially to be there as Jews and Christians. That is problematic to my mind, as I mentioned earlier, because of what the Sharia. You see this with the burqa. It's increasingly common in Europe. Some countries have enacted burqa bans, particularly France. There have been challenges to that at the European Court of Human Rights, but so far those challenges have been upheld. The original rulings have been upheld. So far, burqa bans are legal. Although, for example, certain municipalities in Spain where there are large Muslim populations have tried to impose that, and the Spanish Supreme Court said that was illegal. So you have, differing interpretations in different European countries as to, to allow, burqas in public. What you have here is essentially an image of a no-go zones in France. It's a very hot issue because Fox News, recently did several pieces on no-go zones in France, and the French mayor, socialist, she said she was going to sue Fox News because there was no such thing as no-go zones. But this is from the French government itself, showing there's areas of French cities, essentially, which the state has lost control. No-go zones does not necessarily mean that I can't go in there, although there are many areas where I definitely would not want to go. But what it means essentially is that representatives of the state can't go in there. So police find it very difficult to enter these areas. Fire, ambulance, any sort of representation of the state would find it very, very difficult to enter into these areas. This is an image, the French government has mapped out all of these areas of French cities where it's really not wise to go because they're primarily Muslim. You can find all this stuff. I think I've showed this once before. There's an attempt in Switzerland by migrants who don't like the Swiss flag because it's not multicultural enough. So they want Swiss basically to remove the cross from their flag. And I've shown these images, but I really believe these are very important to just get these in your mind. This is very common practice in European cities on Friday prayers. Essentially, Muslims take over streets. This is in London. This is in front of the cathedral in Milan. It's pretty astonishing if you think of it. This is in Bologna. This is very close to the Vatican in Rome. This is also in Rome. This is in front of the Parliament building in Greece and Athens. This is in Barcelona. It's usually where I've spent a lot of time. This is the streets in Paris. Now, Paris has recently outlawed street prayers on French streets, but it's very difficult to enforce that. The Muslims essentially say that there are not enough mosques, and so if you want Muslims to stop praying on the streets, you should build them more mosques. So what you have now is a situation in which many European governments are essentially giving Muslims free land and parcels of land to build a mosque. And unfortunately, those mosques are being built with monies from Turkey or from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the Gulf Arab states. And essentially, there's competition between Morocco and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and a lot of these Gulf Arab states over jockeying for position over the different Muslim communities within the EU. And so here we have it again. Islam will conquer Rome. For Muslims, Rome is really the symbol of Christendom. Jesus is a slave of Allah. I just mentioned that the spread of Islam in Europe is not just migratory; it's also conversions. A lot of Europeans, tens of thousands of Europeans, are converting to Islam every year. And I think the reason why people like Islam is that it's a black and white legal system. It's a religious, it's a legal system, and in a world like we're in today, where there is total moral chaos, a lot of people find this very appealing, that you tell what you can do and what you can't do. And this is a problem, because a lot of the converts to Islam are even more radical than people who have grown up with Islam as part of their culture all their life. And this is really a problem here, is people like me, or anybody who draws any critical attention to this problem of Islam. And I grant that there are many people who are, who go overboard, insulting people, but drawing attention to this problem, you get called a bigot, Islamophobe, racist, a neo-Nazi. And there's an attempt essentially by the political class in Europe to silence any critical discussion of mass migration from the Muslim world, or the societal changes that are taking place in Europe because of this mass migration. What is happening right now is that in Europe, the media calls it the far right. I don't call them the far right, I call them just normal conservatives, because that doesn't exist in most European countries anymore. I mean, Angela Merkel is the leader of the Christian Democrats, but it's impossible to view the Christian Democrats as a truly conservative party. They are essentially committed to the same social welfare state and the same social economics as the Social Democrats, And so what you have here is that there has been a lot of frustration with the Brexit in the UK and in other areas, and little by little you see a rise of alternative parties, but it's very difficult for these parties to come to power, for the same reason that you have the Trump phenomenon in the United States, is that there are a lot of people who are essentially afraid to identify with certain political leaders for fear of being called racist. My own view is that if the political mainstream parties do not provide a legitimate opening for some of these alternative anti-establishment, anti-immigration parties, that we're going to see a lot more violence in European streets. We're going to see vigilantism, civil war. Some people have talked about that, particularly in France, because there's so much frustration being built up by ordinary Europeans seeing what's going on with this political correctness, and there's no possibility for them to legitimately to vent this anger through the political process. And Marine Le Pen, she is now the most popular political figure in France. If there were an election today, she would be, the French president. What has happened now is that there's several other individuals from the mainstream parties who are beginning to take a hardline view on, mass migration. I don't think it's legitimate. I think what they're trying to do is essentially show, we're going to take care of the Islam problem if you vote for us and you don't vote for Marine Le Pen. And once they win the elections, next year, it'll be back to business as usual. This is the alternative for Germany. This is a very interesting movement in Germany that is becoming ever more popular. They have had a lot of wins in municipal elections this year, and they're most certainly, if things continue the way they are, going to be able to get into the German parliament in elections next year, in the general elections. Some of you know Geert Wilders, who's currently on trial in the Netherlands for offending Muslims, and you've probably seen this guy around, Nigel Farage. I think when you look at all this, what's going on, there are implications for, let's just say, for Israel. And then I'll go with some implications of the United States. We're seeing really is a return of anti-Semitism in Europe on a mass scale. I think most of the anti-Semitism is not from native Germans, it's from the Muslim youth who've been imported into these countries. There's an effort by mainstream parties to call people like Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders as anti-Semites, but these people are actually great friends of Israel. They've traveled to Israel, they have very close relations with the Israeli leadership, and I think it's very difficult to try to brand all of these conservative parties as being anti-Semitic. Now, there are neo-Nazi parties in Germany and other European countries who are truly anti-Semitic. But I think that what I'm talking about here is some of these anti-mainstream parties, they are pro-Israel and they're pro-free market. And I would make these, in a comparison with the United States context, that there would be like Tea Party people. So I think that what we're seeing right now is a mass outbreak of anti-Semitism in Europe that I think is primarily being driven by the Muslim youth. And this is a cemetery in Italy. And I think what's really happening is essentially is that we're seeing large groups of Jews leaving Europe to go to Israel. So I think that is actually positive for Israel. Here's Netanyahu welcoming European Jews. Every time there's a terrorist attack or every time there's some kind of a conflict in the Middle East, you see an uptick in anti-Semitic acts, anti-Israel acts in Europe, and you see the movement of Jews gradually to Israel. This is an image. I could only find this from 2014, but I know for a fact that these numbers have doubled from 2014 to 2015, and they're on track again to double in 2016. So after the United States and Israel, the largest Jewish community is in France, and so you really tens of thousands of Jews are leaving France and making their way to Israel. I think this is going to trend, that's really going to be continuing down the road. Another, apart from the immigration issue and the anti-Semitism issue, another, worrying trend for Israel is essentially that a lot of European leaders are trying to curry favor with the Muslims by being as pro-Palestinian as possible. And so this is an image essentially of a Middle Eastern peace summit that was held in Paris earlier this year. What's interesting about this image? There's no Israelis and there's no Palestinians there, So you see the Europeans are trying to curry favor with the Arabs, and we're seeing really an effort by the Europeans to impose a political settlement on the Israelis and the Palestinians. The question is whether Donald Trump and his administration is going to, allow this to happen. I was quite fearful that a Hillary Clinton administration would essentially go along and help this effort of the Europeans. But we're seeing a lot of anti-Zionism in Europe, anti-Israel. It's different from anti-Semitism, but I guess it's still both sides of the same coin. A lot of efforts in European countries by NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to delegitimize the state of Israel, to use what's called lawfare as a way to delegitimize Israeli leaders and try to try these people in courts for war crimes. And we're going to see an uptick on that as this Muslim migration problem continues. And I think a third really interesting implication for Israel really is to the extent that the EU rejects Turkey's membership in the EU, Turkey is moving to build ties with Iran and with Russia. What we really see here over the last year or so has been establishment of a Turkish, Russian, Iranian access in the Middle East, and I think that is potentially very problematic for Israel in security terms and geopolitical terms. And I think it's also interesting in context of Bible prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39 that a lot of these actors are also involved in this this end time scenario. Is there a link to that, or is this just coincidence? I don't know. I can't speculate. But I do think it's very interesting the way the Middle East is sort of aligning in many ways, just the way the Bible says it will be in the end times. The implications to the United States are massive for what's going on in Europe. ISIS is coming here. ISIS is almost certainly here. The attacks that have happened in the United States have been relatively benign in comparison to a 9/11 attack, but I do believe that something on that scale is coming. It's just completely clear to me that the United States has no idea who's in this country. It has a very difficult time of vetting these people, and as I mentioned earlier, a lot of converts to Islam in the United States, and almost invariably converts to Islam, are more radical, really, than the people who grew up in sort of that culture. We will raise the flag of Allah in the White House. These are threats from ISIS propaganda videos. One of the big problems, security implications for the United States is essentially that there are so many false passports in circulation. Europol believes that there are at least 250,000 false passports in circulation. So you have a situation where people try to come into the United States and Canada on aircraft using a false passport, and it's very, very difficult to, to get control over this situation. I should mention, to the extent that the Iraqi army is successful in removing ISIS from parts of Iraq and Syria, there's a demoralization taking place within the ranks of the Islamic State, and many of these people are beginning to make their way back to Europe. There are at least 5,000 foreign fighters, they're called, jihadists from Europe, who went to fight on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria, who have a lot of military training and who are gradually making their way back into Europe. A lot of these people are posing as migrants, and we have really a security situation of unbelievable proportions that is about to befall Europe. And to the extent that the United States is unable to control its borders, these people are also going to try to make their way into the United States. This was a tweet from Donald Trump last year of Syrians trying to come across the southern border. I just read about a week ago that just recently the border control people caught people from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen, and a number of other Middle Eastern problem countries trying to cross the border. So they're definitely making their way into Latin, Central South America. I know of at least a dozen cases in which ISIS people on false passports have tried to board flights in Argentina and Central America, trying to get into the United States, and they were stopped before they were able to get onto the aircraft. But they're trying, and I know there's a lot of it's very hard to get the data about who's coming across the border, but what I've read is essentially 480,000 people have been detained this year trying to illegally cross the southern border. And the border control people believe that at least twice as many actually come through. What I'm trying to say essentially is that they only catch half of the people coming across the border. So if you just think about that, 1 million people have tried to come across the southern border this year, and 500,000 of them, or 480,000 of them, have possibly succeeded. So you see the importance, to my mind, as a security specialist, of getting control over the southern border. And I'll just close this out with, I'm very encouraged by the national security team that Donald Trump is putting together so far. General Mattis, Michael Flynn, Katie McFarland, she's a friend of mine, and John Bolton, who's my boss. All of these people essentially understand that political Islam is the number one threat facing the United States. This is the first time, I think, in modern, American history, that the main advisors to the president are all on board, understanding that Islam is not, as George W. Bush said, a religion of peace. It's a supremacist ideology that wants to dominate, and I think it's really encouraging, to my mind, that these people understand that the number one top threat that the United States has to get a hold of is the rise, the expansion of political Islam in the West. So essentially, what I will do is I'll just leave it at that. Dr. Ice mentioned that you're not going to have a current events thing this year, so also maybe if you wanted to ask me some current events questions that are not related to this, maybe I can try to take a stab at that, but is that okay?
Sure. Makes me appreciate the Second Amendment. That they don't have in those European countries to protect themselves. But that's just my opinion.
Or the First Amendment.
Or the First Amendment.
Yeah, there's no such thing as free speech in most European countries, so a lot of people who speak out about this are liable to prosecution through hate speech laws. Sure, First and Second Amendment.
Of course, they're trying to get hate speech laws, here. They've got some. Okay, questions? Yes.
So, first of all, thank you very much. That was a tremendous presentation. And you just mentioned the First Amendment. So, thinking politically as a nation that values the freedom of religion, what can a nation realistically do legally in terms of Islam? And you mentioned the religion part of it's tiny, but still it's a religion, and we guarantee freedom of religion. So what kind of nation, like our nation or many of the European nations that value freedom of religion, do, practically speaking, vis-a-vis Islam?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I think that is the number one challenge facing the Trump administration. And the problem is really one of nomenclature. How do you define Islam? Is Islam a religion or is it a political system? It's very, very difficult because the Constitution protects freedom of religion. And I, as a Christian, that's a great, it's everything, you know. The problem is that Islam, as we've pointed out, is not really a religion the way we would understand any religion to be. And I think that the big challenge constitutionally, there's going to be so many lawsuits, so many attempts by pro-Muslim groups, Islamic lobbying groups, to try to overturn any sorts of bans that the Trump people might try to put into place on the grounds of Constitution freedom, and I think that it's an impossible situation to my mind. But I do believe that the way that, some analysts have formulated this as a temporary ban on migration from certain problem countries is a good way to start. Now, as we've seen, I'll just say, of the 1.1 million migrants that came into Germany last year, 500,000 have disappeared. Okay, half of them have gone underground. That is basically because they're not bona fide asylum seekers. They're not bona fide refugees, and they know that they face deportation. So they go underground, and I think that that is really one of the problems with this whole Islam issue is you've got all these guys who don't subscribe to, democracy. They subscribe to Sharia law, and then they go underground. They're not bona fide. And I think to the extent that the United States is unable to vet these people coming from Syria, to legitimately verify that these people are who they say they are, it's better essentially to, to put a ban or a hold or extreme vetting or whatever you want to call it, But I think that issue right there is that's the crux of the issue. How do you deal with Islam when people say it's a religion, but when in fact it's a political system that wants to overturn the Constitution? Mm-hmm.
Does President-elect, am I on? Testing. What switch? Where is it? What are the chances of John Bolton becoming Secretary of State, and does President-elect Trump have this information that you shared with us today?
Well, I think President-elect Trump is very aware. I think that's one of the reasons why he was elected. He is not let's say political correctness is not an impediment for him. And it's about time. I think so far that he has not made a decision regarding who the Secretary of State. I prefer John Bolton because I know him, and he is he really understands geopolitics. The art of geopolitics is a lost science because people don't teach that anymore in the university system, particularly in the elite universities that produce the people who run the State Department, who run the Pentagon. And so I think he's one of the last of an old school brand of people who really understand geopolitics. I think the concern with the Trump people is...
Did somebody lean on the lights or something back there? Okay.
Yeah, I think the problem with the Trump people is they're afraid that somebody like John Bolton may not get through the Senate, confirmation process. And I think that, in my mind, John Bolton would have also made a very good national security advisor, which does not require Senate confirmation. But I think the Trump people are really looking at somebody who is able to, garner enough support in the Senate. And, to be honest, John Bolton is a polemic figure, particularly for people on the left, because he believes what he believes, and he's not afraid to say so. So I think that decision has not yet been made, but it's coming very soon, within, days probably.
Habakkuk chapter 1:12 says, Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. Thou hast ordained them for judgment. And, Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction. Thou art purer of eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he. And I think the problem we all have is, why is God allowing it? But is it possible that the way the Jews fell from the Lord and got into pagan idolatry to the point that their wicked neighbors, the Chaldeans, were less wicked than they, were allowed to chasten them as, like with whips from the Lord? I wonder, do you see any possibility that prophetically the Christian West is being whipped by the Islamic East by God?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I believe that is in fact the case. I think it's a tragedy when you see what's going on in Germany, and you think that we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. All over Germany, they're having tours next year to celebrate trips to Martin Luther's birthplace and, Wittenberg and all that. And Germany and all of these Western European countries, and to a large extent the United States as well, are post-Christian, hyper-secular. And I think that we're dealing here with a spiritual problem. Islam is a spiritual problem. It's a demonic force, obviously, that is challenging, dominion of the world. And so as a Christian, you can't see this apart from a spiritual dimension. I'll also add that I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe he's sovereign over every aspect of his creation and of the order, and he's allowing this for some reason. And I suspect that it might be an act of judgment. Now, it's very interesting. Sometimes it's referred to as the left, as the red-green alliance. Is the socialists, secularists in Europe and the Islamists, they have one thing in common, and they hate Judeo-Christianity, And that is they're basically aligning themselves to eradicate Judeo-Christian. When I speak about Judeo-Christian I usually just refer to the Ten Commandments and that moral code, because Judeo-Christianity can be a very, what does it mean, But I think when I refer to it, it's the Ten Commandments and that moral code. And that is what people hate. They hate any types of restraints on their behavior by God through the Ten Commandments. And I think what they're trying to do really is to do away with that, and the Muslims are on board with that. What's going to happen is once the Muslims take control, if it comes to that, because I personally believe the Lord is probably going to intervene, at least through the rapture, hopefully, that these Muslims are going to go after the socialists, because the Muslims hate homosexuals and gays and all of the abortion and all that stuff that the left stands for, So it's a marriage of convenience right now that it's going to come back to bite the socialists in a bad way. And so, I think this is part of the judgment of God, but, I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Appreciate the information you gave us this afternoon. I'd like to respond as somebody who's lived in Germany for 40 years. I think much of what you said I can identify with. There's certainly a growing problem with Islam and Muslims and the refugees coming into the country. I think it's important, though, to mention that there's another side to the issue. We started a church 10 years ago in the city where we live, a city of 40,000, and we have thanked the Lord a number of times over the last 3 or 4 years for the open doors. And many of the refugees who are coming are disillusioned with Islam and open for the gospel. We have seen, I would estimate, 15 to 20 come to the faith in the last 2 years. I could share some stories today that just give us goosebumps when you think about it. People who have come, and we see some of the things that are happening as really the Lord bringing the world to us. I'm on the city council in the social area in the city where we live. We have a good relationship with the city. We have what they call the tafel. We give food to people who are in need, mainly refugees. They have an opportunity to come and have contact with the church. And I would say there are many who are very open to the gospel. And I think one of the things we have to think about after the presentation that you made is what's the solution? we're not going to change things. Things are going to continue. And part of the solution, I think, is the gospel. We've got to reach these people with the gospel. And we want to see that opportunity and take advantage of it. And I'd like to just also say we've lived there. I don't live in fear in Germany. We live in a city of 40,000, travel freely. One of the things that excites me is we have opportunities there that we don't have here. We as a school go into public schools once a year in evangelization weeks and have freedom to present the gospel, and we're thankful for that. And when we talk about no-go zones, Germans look at us and say there are no-go zones here in America too, and have the same criticisms of us in that area. I agree with what you said, I identify with much of what you said, but I think we have to keep our eyes open to the fact that there's another side and opportunities there that we have to take advantage of.
So how do you approach them with the gospel, one-on-one, or did they come to you?
Yeah, both. Can I give you one illustration?
Yes.
3 weeks ago, one of our elders went to the home of a family who had come to our church out from Afghanistan, mother, father, daughter, son, sat down and shared the gospel with them, and the 17-year-old daughter said, I want to accept Christ. He prayed with her, said amen, and the mother said, I want to accept Christ too. And after they were done praying, he said to the son, if you'd like, we could talk tomorrow. He said, no, I want to accept Christ now.
Did they speak German?
There was, one of them spoke good German, the other two understood German, and she translated for them. And the father came to faith, and the next night we baptized all four of them. That's an unusual situation. That's an unusual situation. What I'm saying is a lot of these people who are coming are open. There are others that are coming that are very dangerous. We realize that too.
I would just add one thing to that. I have contacts with a group called Open Doors in Germany. There is a lot of persecution of Christians in the refugee shelters by Muslims. But I will say that not every person who confesses Christ is doing so legitimately. There are a lot of migrants. I know of quite a number of cases of people who say they have converted to Christianity because they believe by doing that they can get their asylum application approved more easily. In other words, the German government will look upon the asylum application of a Christian more favorably than a Muslim. So I think that there's really two sides to this, but we should obviously give glory to God for every opportunity there is to bring any single individual Muslim out of what is essentially a cult. Mm-hmm.
And not just to add to that, the Muslims are allowed to lie to an infidel. That's part of it too, so we have to be careful about that. But really my comment or question has to do with, in March 2011, Hillary Clinton wanted to bomb Syria in order to get rid of Gaddafi because of the Arab Spring. So that happened. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, or whichever way I said it, Gaddafi, Assad, Syria, whoever they wanted to bomb. It was in March 2011. And it was because of the Arab Spring. And I think that is what started a lot of this. Do you think maybe some of this was planned? I mean, you look at how much we are trying to bring the Muslims in the government today, existence. I mean, is that part of the plan from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a very important point to make, is that essentially this migration crisis is essentially the creation of really bad decisions by Western policymakers. Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, they were really nasty people, but they maintained a certain degree of stability in a part of the world that is sectarian and completely it's impossible for democracy to take root in these areas. You need a strong man to maintain order, and by removing these individuals from power, it's created a whole cascade, particularly with the Iran thing. By removing Saddam Hussein, we removed a very important balance of power in the Middle East that has allowed now Iran to become a hegemon. And I think the same thing with Libya. When Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown, many of the jihadists went to Syria and wanted to take out President Assad next. And so a lot of these problems in the Middle East are self-inflicted. Is there a plan? I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I don't think that there's an organized plan. There's one conspiracy that I do believe in, and that is in the Bible. And that is essentially that Satan is trying to overthrow God from his throne. He's been trying to do that from the beginning. That's the only conspiracy theory that I know is a fact. But whether or not this is all organized or, you see all this stuff on the internet, I don't get into that. All I know is what's happened has happened. There have been very bad decisions have been taken by intervening in certain states, and this is blowback from that, to my mind. So I'll just leave the comments at that. But as you made, the point that you made, the West is to blame for this, very clearly.
Yeah. Wasn't that Libya policy totally done by Hillary and the lady from Ireland? What's her name?
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure on the U.S. administration from Western European countries, particularly the British. They wanted to remove Muammar Gaddafi from power. There was this idea that the Arab Spring would move from Tunisia to Libya, and there was the revolution in Egypt, that it would basically bring about a blossoming of democracy in the Middle East. And actually, the exact opposite has happened. What we're now is total chaos in the Middle East, and there's no way to put the Middle East back together. It's never going to be back to the stability that it once was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my question is kind of a follow-on to that. I've been going to Jordan in a ministry for about 15 years, and in Jordan, a lot of Christian refugees come in from Iraq and Syria and Egypt. And every Christian that I've talked to that's come in from these just devastated countries all say the same thing, that they were far better off under a secular dictator, even though he may have been, he has human rights violations and things of that sort. And so, the U.S. policy, it seems like under Republicans and Democrats, has been to overthrow secular dictators, Saddam under the Republicans and Libya, and now Assad is the targets, Mubarak. And every time we've done that, it's created a situation much worse for the Christian Arabs that are there. And so I'm just wondering what your perspective is. Is the U.S. going to, under the Trump administration and maybe the influence under John Bolton and others, going to change its policy on this and basically support the secular dictators who put a check on Islam, filling the void, and maybe putting pressure then on the secular dictators to improve the situation as opposed to regime change?
Yeah, I think that the United States has had, fourth regime change. I don't think that, with the possible exception of Iran, I think these guys coming in are hardliners with Iran, that they're going to try to see how to reverse the Iran deal. And Katie McFarland has said that she's interested in fomenting discontent in Iran. In other words, the idea that somehow the Middle East can be put back together is impossible. All these dictators were minorities, and the Christians are minorities as well in Iraq and in Syria and in other parts. So the dictators and the Syrians and the Christians essentially protected each other to a certain extent because they were all, minorities in a Sunni Islamic, area. So for all these circumstances to come back together, I find it very difficult. The Christian community in the Middle East is decimated, and it's never going to be back to what it once was. I don't see it. I hope that answers your question.
A question here about Erdogan and Turkey. It seems like he's trying to revive the Ottoman Empire, and with the allies he's trying to bring to himself, and the power struggle between the Arab factors. What do you see? How do you see that playing out, or what was the...
Yeah, the question is regarding the Turkish president, Erdogan, and his ideas of reestablishing the caliphate, the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Essentially, that's been his dream from the beginning. And he was on track to make that a reality until ISIS beat him to it. So now you have competing caliphates, essentially. And I think that Erdogan is trying, essentially, to consolidate power in Turkey, trying to get rid of the Gulenists. Fethullah Gulen is a cleric who lives in Pennsylvania, and he's a real challenger to Erdogan. Is Turkey going to be able to achieve that? I think in the current geopolitical reality, no. Russia is now in the game in the Middle East. It's never going to leave the Middle East. President Obama, with his red line fiasco and with all of the foolish, feckless policies, has essentially allowed Russia a permanent presence in the Middle East. That has always been the dominant foreign policy priority of every administration during the Cold War. Don't let the Russians into the Middle East. And Obama has done it in 4 years, and particularly in his second term. And so I think that the conditions are not there for Turkey to have an expansionist foreign policy at this point. But as you know, in the Middle East, everything can change from one day to the next.
So do you believe that the Obama administration seems to have favored Iran as their
It's very hard to figure out exactly whether the Obama people had a plan or whether, honestly, I don't know. I mean, a lot of scholars have tried to work through it, I don't think there was a plan. I think there was just a series of decisions that went bad, and it's just one after another until we got to this point. But I think President Obama really wanted to make it impossible for there ever to be a war with Iran. I think that's the overarching emphasis of President Obama is to make sure that there can never be a war with Iran, because a war with Iran would be big. Completely different category of the removing Saddam Hussein from power, or the first Gulf War. And I think that what he's done is tried to create all the conditions to make it impossible for a next president or for Israeli government to do anything against Iran, because that Iranian nuclear program now is a fait accompli. And I think what's going to happen with Turkey and with Russia and Iran is they have a lot of mutual interests, particularly in energy. And I think that they're going to find a way to work together increasingly, and particularly if Turkey is shunned by the EU. And I think that that is just the future. There's going to be an alliance between those three powers. And not any one of those powers is a dominant power, even though Russia has nuclear weapons. But I think that they'll check each other. But there'll be those three powers who will really try to run, the show. And it's going to be very, very difficult for the United States to reassert any sort of leadership authority in the Middle East at this point. I just don't see. We've given up so much. The United States has given up so much. But, it's hard to say for sure.
Go ahead.
All right. I want to talk about Lebanon a little bit, just what happened there in the 60s. National Geographic had a special on Lebanon, said it's the Garden of Eden of the Middle East, and was very prosperous, largely a Christian nation. In the 60s, late 60s, they had a lot of refugees, Muslim refugees that came in, and they were the only country that took them. And anyway, they slowly came in, and by the 80s, all hell broke loose, and now they're a Muslim hellhole right now. And you think they see that as a model, maybe as a way to do it, maybe as a model that Muhammad himself used at Mecca? I don't know. Is this a strategy, you think?
Yeah, I think the Lebanese situation is unique. Essentially, all those migrants that came into Lebanon were Palestinians that were kicked out of Jordan. There was an attempt to overthrow the king of Jordan, and he expelled them all essentially to Lebanon, and then the Palestinians tried to overthrow essentially the Lebanese government. The other component of Lebanon, which is very complex but super fascinating, is essentially that it's a client of Iran. And since Iran does not have a direct border with Israel, it needs to keep Assad in power, and it needs to keep the Hezbollah people in essentially the leadership position of that country. In other words, to exert leverage against Israel. And I think really that makes Lebanon a very unique country, and it definitely is not a model for anybody except for their food, which is excellent.
Yeah, Trump has promised to move the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem. Do you know what the prospects for that would be? And secondly, what would be the results internationally?
Yeah, that's a very good question. He could do it if he wanted to. He said he was going to do it. It would have tremendous consequences, though. I don't know if the Europeans would acknowledge it. They would not recognize Jerusalem as the capital. So there would still be.
They don't do it.
Yeah,
as
so
it
it would be the
is.
United States taking a unilateral action that probably very few other countries would recognize, and it would basically create a wrath of terrorism from the Palestinian side. I mean, that would be basically, it would unleash really a hornet's nest. To my mind, it would probably be better to leave it ambiguous, and when Jesus comes back, he's going to establish, Jerusalem is going to be the capital.
Right.
But if he does it, there will be consequences. But
Also, it seems that Trump is talking about solving the Middle East crisis, with Israel and everything, and the Palestinians. I mean, is he really serious about that?
yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think anybody. I think the time for the two-state solution has passed.
Yeah.
There was an open period of the Oslo agreement in this two-state where it could have been viable. I think the Lord intervened multiple times to harden the hearts of Arafat and many other Palestinian leaders to make the two-state solution impossible. I don't think that Trump is going to probably invest a lot of political capital in that. If he does, I don't think he's going to be particularly successful. But I don't believe that John Bolton believes in a two-state solution, and KT McFarland certainly doesn't. And so I just don't see that that is going to be a priority. But I don't have any inside knowledge. I just know what these people believe, the advisors believe. So,
Do you know if Trump plans on cleaning out the State Department or anything like that? Or, I have no idea, but.
I think the State Department cannot be cleaned out. It is just
Right.
it's in a I went to Georgetown University to become a diplomat, and once I had an understanding of the reality of the State Department, I decided that was not for me. I'm better in the think tank world. I don't think that it can be cleaned out. It's just a culture, an institutional culture of 40, 50, 60 years that is pro-Arab. And a lot of these guys threaten, we're going to resign if Trump becomes president. But these guys like their salaries and their pensions, and they're not going to resign. So I think the only solution is somebody like John Bolton, because I think even Mitt Romney, to a certain extent, is going to cave in to build bridges with the State
Right.
Department bureaucracy. But I think Rudy Giuliani or John Bolton, they would essentially create a parallel decision-making apparatus within the State Department. So all the bureaucrats, 20,000 or whatever, they would basically do what they do. But the real decision-making would be within a small group of people. That's how I would envision it.
So, do you believe that Israel will end up annexing Judea and Samaria? You don't have an opinion on
No.
that? Okay. They're passing legislation and that kind of stuff in the Knesset. Got a text while you were speaking from Jerusalem Post to that effect or something. Not that they were going to annex it, but
Yeah.
dealing with the so-called settlements.
I see that probably is jockeying for maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu to keep his coalition in place. But I think that if Israel were to do that, that would unleash so much fury from the Europeans and from the Security Council that it would be counterproductive in this particular political context, in the time that we're in. Maybe in the future there would be an opening. Like, for example, if the king of Jordan were overthrown and all of Jordan becomes a Muslim Brotherhood ISIS den, and Israel needs to annex that to secure its own border, that's a different geopolitical context. But like today, I think that would be very counterproductive because it would really harm Israel, and it would give a lot of ammunition to the delegitimizers of Israel. But if they do it, I would be very happy about that.
Well, do you have an opinion of where you think, say, in 5 or 10 years will be if Jesus doesn't return in the Middle East, in Israel, in that whole area?
Yeah, well, I think the king of Jordan his days are numbered. That is very, very shaky. I don't know what is going to happen in Syria. I think Assad is going to stay. I think the Russians are going to be permanently there. I think Iran is going to become a nuclear power. I think it's inevitable. And, I think that, going a little bit to prophecy, just total speculation, is that I think the Lord is really organizing or reorganizing the geopolitical chessboard in the Middle East for what he is going to do with Israel. and the rest of the world during the tribulation period. It's just, to my mind, analyzing this stuff, it doesn't seem like this can possibly be a coincidence that all of this stuff is coming together at the same time, you know. But for, you know, decades, we've all been waiting for the Lord's return, and we've all speculated, and things have changed in the Middle East, you know. And so it's impossible to say, but I have a hunch and a real yearning that the Lord comes back soon and he puts order into this. And so hopefully it won't be 75 years, you know.
Well, thank you.